Good evening. My Bible is open to the book of Obadiah. Obadiah chapter 1. If you find an Obadiah chapter 2, please let me know because my Bible does not have an Obadiah chapter 2. But we'll be looking at the book of Obadiah tonight. You know, that's a fun name to say. Obadiah. Go home and tell your spouse, go home and tell your kids, Obadiah. Just say it. It's just fun to say. But even though we like to say his name, even if it's a fun name to say, we quite frankly don't know a lot about the man Obadiah. We don't know where he was born. We don't know where he lived. We don't know when he lived. But we do know he has a vision from God. And it's an interesting vision. And when Obadiah has this vision, things are not going good for the people of God. Their cities have been destroyed. Jerusalem, that great city that they have, has even been burned with fire. The people are in exile, and the people are probably starting to wonder, is God going to be faithful to his promises? Does God still remember his people? And they look across the river, across the Jordan River, across the Dead Sea, and they look at their neighbors to the east, the nation of Edom. And things are going well there in Edom. Their cities are still standing. Edom was fabulously wealthy. Things are going really, really good for Edom. And they don't think they can fall. They don't think they're going to fall captive to Babylon. They don't think they're going to fall captive to the other nations that would rise and fall there in the ancient world. But Obadiah has this vision. And he says, not so fast, Edom. Edom, even you too will fall. And there in 21 short verses there in the book of Obadiah, Obadiah tells the people of Edom that judgment is coming. But there's still hope for the people of God. Judgment and hope. Isn't that the message of the minor prophet that we looked at over the last 12 or 18 months? But this book is also a warning message. It's a warning message against pride. It's a reminder to us, even today, that pride goes before destruction. But here in this book, we also see three promises. Three promises that God makes to his people. Three promises that remind us that God will deliver his people. God will always be faithful to his promises. And these three promises really drive the story of the book of Obadiah. Three promises that I think have some application for us today. Let's go ahead and dig into the text there in Obadiah 1, beginning in verse 1, where it says, the vision of Obadiah. This is what the Lord God has said about Edom. We have heard a message from the Lord. An envoy has been sent among the nations. Rise up and let's go to war against her. Look, I will make you insignificant among the nations. You will be deeply despised. Your arrogant heart has deceived you. You who live in the clefts of the rock, who in your home on the heights, who say to yourself, who can bring me down to the ground? Though you seem to soar like an eagle and make your nest among the stars. Even from there, God says, I will bring you down. This is the Lord's declaration. If thieves came to you, if marauders by night, how ravaged you would be. Wouldn't they steal only what they wanted? If grape harvesters came to you, wouldn't they leave a few grapes? How Esau will be pillaged, his hidden treasures searched out. Everyone who has a treaty with you will drive you to the border. Everyone at peace with you will deceive you and conquer you. Those who eat your bread will set a trap for you. He will be unaware of it. In that day, this is the Lord's declaration, will I not eliminate the wise ones of Edom and those who understand from the hill country of Esau? Taman, your warriors will be terrified so that everyone from the hill country of Esau will be destroyed by slaughter. The first promise we see there in the book of Obadiah is a promise of judgment. There in the text, Obadiah begins by saying, the Lord has something to say to you, Edom. And as we think about the Old Testament, we are so programmed when we look at the Old Testament to think immediately of Israel and Judah and God's people from Genesis to Malachi. That's what we're programmed to think. And yet, here at the very beginning of the book of Obadiah tells us, this time, this message is specifically about Edom. And you see, Edom and Israel had a long history going back 1,000 years or more. You see, Edom was the descendants of Esau, and Israel was the descendants of Jacob. And so for generations upon generations upon generation, that sibling rivalry that we read about there in the book of Genesis played out until you really had two competing nations that really did not get along on any level. Edom and Israel were basically cousins, but the type of cousins that don't really talk to each other at family reunions. And to me, it's very interesting that the book of Obadiah is focused on Edom, not Israel, not Judah. Obadiah's message is all about Edom, the enemy, the rival of God's people. And he says there in the text that a message has gone out, an envoy has gone out. The nations are gathering. War is coming. Judgment is on its way there for the people of Edom. And this is all a work of God. And this message of doom and destruction and devastation would have shocked the Edomites, because the Edomites didn't think they could fall. You see, the Edomites made their home in a very mountainous area of the world, an area much like that right there, an area just like this, an area that was virtually inaccessible, an area that if you have forts and cities built on mountains in the ancient world would have been very, very difficult to conquer. And so Edom was very, very proud. And that's probably there in the text the reason why they respond the way they do there in verse 3. When Obadiah says, your arrogant heart has deceived you. You think you live in the clefts of the rocks. You think you live up high. And you think because you live up high, no one can destroy you. And yet God says there in verse 4, I will bring you down. They thought they were indestructible. They were filled with pride, and yet God says there in Obadiah chapter 1, I will humble you. And isn't that what we see all throughout Scripture, how God over and over and over again there in the story of Scripture humbles the proud? Just think about that very famous Bible verse there in the book of Proverbs. Pride goes before the fall. And why is that? Why does pride go before the fall? Because pride is deceptive. Pride makes us think that we can't fall, that we won't fall. Pride makes us think sometimes that we are greater than God, that we know more than God. And yet as we look at our own lives, there are a few things in our lives that are more deadly and destructive than pride. Our pride makes us think that we can drink that drink and we won't get drunk. Our pride makes us think we can surround ourselves with evil companions and surround ourselves with these bad organizations and not be influenced by them. Pride makes us think that it won't happen to me. And over and over and over again, pride deceives us. And we fall flat on our face. And that's what we see Obadiah describe here in the text. That even though Edom boasted in their power, even though they boasted in the fact they lived in the mountains in areas that were virtually indestructible, God says there in the text, you will be devastated by judgment. Those forts that you've trusted in, those cities that you've built, those warriors that you've trained, they're all going to fall. And those warriors, those special warriors that you've boasted in, verse 9 says, they're going to be terrified because of the judgment that is coming. everything is going to be destroyed. Edom will fall. That proud nation, that nation that boasted in their own wisdom, that nation would be humbled by God's judgment. It didn't matter how great Edom thought they were no match for God's power. And that's a lesson they were going to have to learn the hard way. And that's a lesson sometimes we in our own lives have to learn the hard way. I think about a story of something that happened 111 years ago this month. There was a boat, perhaps you've heard of it, the Titanic, set sail from England 111 years ago this month. And when it set sail, they boasted that God himself could not sink this ship. And yet halfway across the Atlantic, on its very first voyage, the Titanic hit an iceberg. And 1,500 people died that night. Pride goes before destruction. So if there's anything we can learn from Edom here in the book of Obadiah, I think it's that when we exalt ourselves, God will come in judgment. God promises that here in the book of Obadiah. But Obadiah goes on, beginning in verse 10, and says these things. You, he says, will be covered with shame and destroyed forever because of violence done to your brother Jacob. On the day you stood aloof, on the day strangers captured his wealth, while foreigners entered his city gate and cast lots for Jerusalem, you were just like one of them. Do not gloat over your brother in the day of his calamity. Do not rejoice over the people of Judah in the day of their destruction. Do not boastfully mock in their day of distress. Do not enter my people's city gate in the day of their disaster. Yes, you do not gloat over their misery in the day of their disaster. And do not appropriate their possessions in the day of their disaster. Do not stand at the crossroads and cut off their fugitives. And do not hand over their survivors in the day of distress. Verse 16, for the day of the Lord is near against all the nations. As you have done, it will be done to you. What you deserve, Obadiah says, will return on your own head. As you have drunk on my holy mountain, so all the nations will drink continually. They will drink and gulp down and be as though they had never been. The second promise we see here in the text is a promise of justice. You know, as we read that description there in Obadiah chapter 1, the first 9 verses of the coming destruction on Edom, maybe it's tempting for us to go, why would God destroy an entire people? Why would he get rid of all of them? Well, and then we read verse 10 through 16 and we get it. We understand it because even in our own feeble minds, our feeble human minds, we understand there's a need for justice. We hear stories about children being abused, and we want justice in that situation. We read a story, we watch a news report about an innocent person being murdered, and we want justice in that situation. See, even in our own feeble human minds, we want justice. And so what Obadiah describes there in verses 10 through 16 explains why God is coming in judgment. It's justice. God is returning all those sins, all the evil that Edom had done on themselves. It's a response to Edom's pride. It's a response to how their pride was demonstrated in their treatment of others. And in particular, Israel. How Israel, when Israel was in their greatest hour of need, when Babylonian armies were marching into the land, when they were surrounding Jerusalem, when Israel was in that great hour of need, Edom just sat there and watched. They fiddled while Israel burned. And really, that's what pride does to us. Pride allows us to rejoice when others fall. Pride allows us to exalt ourselves over others. Pride allows us to be happy when others suffer. Pride robs us of compassion for others. And that's exactly what we see from Edom here in the book of Obadiah. Their pride allowed them to show violence, verse 10, to their own brother Jacob. And I think it's interesting that Obadiah calls it your own brother Jacob, because it brings out that family bond that Edom and Israel had. That in their greatest hour of need, Edom doesn't come running to their own brother's aid. That Edom wasn't just violent to their enemies, Edom was violent to their own brothers. And as we read the description of everything Edom did to Israel there in verses 10 through 16, I think it should remind us and emphasize to us that God cares about how we treat people. And because Edom was violent toward Israel, because they didn't show love toward Israel, because they didn't help Israel, Edom would be destroyed forever. But there in the text, Edom doesn't just show violence to Israel, they do a couple other things too. They watched, verse 11, as Jerusalem is plundered. They rejoiced when Israel is destroyed, verse 12. Verse 13, they entered the city's gates themselves, and they also plundered Jerusalem after the Babylonians went through. And to make matters worse, as the Jews are fleeing the Babylonian armies, look what they do there in verse 14. They stand at the crossroads, and they cut down the fugitives. They've cut down the refugees. Think about that for a second. I know this happened a long time ago in a land far, far away. Because of that, it's really easy for us to kind of disconnect everything that Obadiah is describing here in the text. But Obadiah describes a real city under attack, with real people fleeing for their lives, with real people being murdered in cold blood as they flee for their lives. And so we read this text and we should be wondering, where is the justice? And God tells us here in the text, this is where the justice is. It's coming. Edom should have seen Israel's distress and come to Israel's aid. Edom should have seen Israel's judgment and repented and turned back to God. But Edom didn't. Instead, Edom rejoiced at Israel's destruction. They mocked as Israel fell. They murdered the Israelites as they fled for their lives. And so Obadiah describes his message. He summarizes his message there in verse 15. He says, the day of the Lord is near. In other words, judgment is coming. I'm about to bring you, Edom, to justice. And here's how I'm going to bring you to justice, verse 15. As you have done, it's going to be done to you. As you plundered others, you're going to be plundered. As you murdered others, you're going to be murdered itself. Justice will be served. But this message isn't just for Edom. This message is for all the nations, verse 15. For the day of the Lord is near, verse 15, against all the nations. You see, all nations will face God's judgment. All nations who act like Edom will face God's justice. They will be humbled and they will be destroyed. God will repay each one according to his works. That's what justice is all about. And this should be a warning message to all of us, and that God will bring justice on every nation. And yes, I think that includes America in that. But I want to bring this home to us as individuals today. Because a day is coming when each one of us, that we will stand before God and we will give an account of everything we've ever done, everything we've ever said, every thought that we've ever had. And on that day, there will be no grace. There will be no mercy for those who reject God, for those who are like Edom and pridefully stand before God in this life and say, I don't need you. There will be no grace. There will be no mercy for people like that. In that day, there will be justice. The Lord will give us what we deserve. And I think this should terrify us. Because if we are living in sin, if we have forgotten God, if we are living in willful rebellion to God, then we will face God's justice. God will bring on us the judgment and pain and suffering and justice that we deserve. But I also think this should be an encouraging message for all of us. Because if we are a child of God and we look out and see all the sin and all the suffering in this world, we also know that there is coming a day when God will make it right. When we look out in the world around us and we wonder, what will God do? We can be confident because God promises justice. It doesn't matter how discouraging this life may be, how strong the suffering may get. God will give the wicked what they deserve. I'll give you two quick examples in the Bible of how God gives the wicked what they deserve. Think back to the book of Exodus, the very opening chapters of the book of Exodus. Pharaoh there in the text tells the midwives to throw the Jewish boys into the Nile River, right? To drown them, to kill the Jewish boys. And yet what happened to Pharaoh's army? They were thrown into the Red Sea. Several hundred years later, as Daniel is there in exile, and his enemies come up against him, they conspire against him, and they say, look, king, make this decree that anyone who prays to any other god except for you will be thrown into the lion's den. And yet Daniel goes in there and prays. And what happened to Daniel's enemies? They get thrown into the lion's den. God will give sinners and the wicked what they deserve. In fact, over and over and over again in the story of Scripture, God tells his people, God promises his people justice. And I think that's a reason for us to hope. Because the suffering in this life may get intense. It may be rough. The first century Christians knew that well. But they also knew that God would make it right at the end. But let's go ahead down to Obadiah 1 and verse 17 where the text tells us, but there will be a deliverance on Mount Zion, and it will be holy. The house of Jacob will dispossess those who dispossess them. Then the house of Jacob will be a blazing fire, and the house of Joseph a burning flame. But the house of Esau will be a stubble. Jacob will set them on fire and consume Edom. Therefore, no survival will remain of the house of Esau, for the Lord has spoken. People from the Negev will possess the hill country of Esau. Those from the Judean foothills will possess the land of the Philistines. They possess the territories of Ephraim and Samaria, while Benjamin will possess Gilead. The exiles of the Israelites who are in Halah, who are among the Canaanites as far as Zarephath, as well as the exiles of Jerusalem who are in the Sepharad, will possess the cities of the Negev. Saviors, verse 21, will ascend Mount Zion to rule over the hill country of Esau, and the kingdom will be the Lord. The third promise here in the text is a promise of deliverance. Even as Obadiah promises to bring justice and judge Edom, Obadiah also comes with a message of hope that Edom would be completely and totally destroyed, but God's people would be delivered. Obadiah is a message of assurance for God's people. That God, even though they were in exile, even though their cities were destroyed, God would still be faithful to his people. And there in the text, I believe God makes three commitments to the people. The first one is found there in verse 17 and 18, where it says God will restore his people. It describes there in verse 17 and 18 how the people, even though they are far off, there will be deliverance. And they will dispossess those who dispossess them. And how Jacob will be a blazing fire. It pictures that restoration of Jacob and Joseph. But it also there in verse 19 and 20 describes how God will defeat their enemies. Just look at the list of a couple of the enemies there. The people from the Negev will possess the hill country of Esau. So Esau is defeated there in verse 19. The people from the Judean foothills, verse 19, will possess the land of the Philistines. God's people will have their enemies defeated in that time. And finally, there in verse 21, there is this reminder that, yes, God will establish his kingdom. The book that began by describing Edom's pride and Edom's coming judgment and justice ends with a message of hope that God's people would be delivered. They would be restored. They would return to the land, and Edom would be destroyed forever. And there in verse 21, and the kingdom will be the Lord's. Judgment and hope. That's the message of the minor prophets. Edom would be judged, but there was always going to be hope for the people of God. And I think that's a message we still need today. Because sometimes as we look at our life and our society, it seems like sin is everywhere. We can't go anywhere. We can't turn on the TV. We can't go down to the coffee shop without being flooded and reminded of, with all the immorality around us, without being reminded of people boasting in sin. Some days it even seems like the bad guys are going to win. Some days we feel like giving up. But the book of Obadiah reminds us that we don't need to give up. We need to stay true. That just as God promised deliverance to Israel, he has provided salvation for us through Jesus Christ. God will have the final word. God will bring judgment. God will bring justice. God will bring deliverance. He will provide salvation. But there's one thing standing between us and the salvation God provides, and that's pride. Pride causes us to continue in sin. Pride causes us to live in sin, to rebel against God, to make us think we can do it all on our own. But just like Edom here in the book of Obadiah, we are reminded that the proudful have no hope of salvation. The proud can only look forward to judgment. And judgment is coming. A day is coming when God will humble the proud. A day is coming when God will exalt the righteous. A day is coming when everything will be reversed. And that brings us to Jesus. Because Jesus came to earth, lived that perfect life, that sinless life. And yet, despite the fact he lived that perfect life, that sinless life, Jesus bore our judgment Jesus took our justice, also we could be delivered. Jesus is coming back. And when Jesus is coming back, will he find us watching? If we can help you get in a right relationship with God, we would love to help you get ready for that day so you can be ready when Jesus returns. If we can help you with anything, please let us know while together we stand and sing.